the sponsor table in the back at the break and see what some of our sponsors have to offer. So I'm going to read those right now because we're really grateful. So sponsors, Bayberry Company, Belknap Landscape, Burnt Timber Brewing and Tavern, Harvest Market, JC Signs up there and our banners and our signs. Lake Wentworth Tours and More. When the ice goes out, you can take a tour of Lake Wentworth with Bob Spear. New Hampshire Boat Museum, thank you as always. Port City Pretzels, be sure and take a bag full home. Summit Irrigation and Lighting. Teco Block, Stella Luna, Tracing's Graphics, and WASR. We thank you. So our organization, the Wentworth Watershed Association, has just had its first birthday a few months ago as a combined organization. We are thrilled to announce that Julie Brown will be starting with us as Executive Director on April 16th and joining Bobby Budman in our office to continue to roll out our mission and our events for the area. We have a table of our information over there, so pick up anything you want, and there's a wonderful map of the Wentworth watershed over there. So here's your program for the evening. There's been a slight change. Jay Aubie's going last but not least, and Barbara and Lisa are going first. After Barbara's second part of the first presentation, we'll have a break so you can hit the food again, but I'd also encourage you to sneak over and get something if you're hungry and thirsty. This program also reminds you of the critical date of the Wentworth Water Summit #2, and it's right here, May 12th. The program also features the impressive bios of our presenters, which I ask you to read, because I made a deal with them that if they sent them to us in advance, I wouldn't read them out loud. But I think it's well worth reading their backgrounds. As I was thinking about this program, I thought, maybe next April, we'll be at a point where people can come together and bring their solutions and show them off and tell how they did them, tell how easy they were, or what fun they had, or share ideas. So, let's see if by next year we can roll out some really cool things and share them with each other. I want to welcome the speakers, and so we have Jay, wherever he is. He's back there. That's Jay Aubie. And then we have Barbara McMillan, and then we have Lisa Lucijan. I didn't do it right. So I was talking to them about questions. I think it might not be a bad idea if you have a pressing question, we'll try to handle them as they come up. And if it gets too onerous, we'll expedite and hold them till the end. But I think some interaction would be great. So Barbara agreed to that. And join me in welcoming our presenters, and welcome to all of you.
Thanks, Dan. Can everybody hear me okay? This is actually the first venue that I've done where people have offered free beer, and I do think that's a great way to kind of fill the house. When I was growing up, my friends started a band, and they called it Free Beer, and so we always had a ton of people at our thinking we were misrepresenting ourselves a little bit, but so I am here, actually, I work at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, or DES, and I work on the New Hampshire Soak Up the Rain program, and I work with Lisa. And what we do is we actually sort of get out there and do things like this. We educate people, residents, and homeowners, like these two people from Newmarket here in this slide, and small businesses, and try to make people aware of what they're doing on their property and how it might impact water quality. Maybe they're contributing some pollution to water bodies nearby. And we basically do that by partnering with organizations like you guys, like the Wentworth Watershed Association or UNH Cooperative Extension, who's a huge partner, and other partners that help us kind of get that information out there. And we provide different types of tools, resources, and any type of technical assistance to actually get people to do something different on their properties to reduce the amount of pollution getting into water bodies. And in some cases, we really like people to install like a practice on their properties. So what I'm going to cover today is I'm going to talk a little bit about why you should care about water pollution and what you're doing on your property. And then Lisa's going to talk about how you can do different practices, and that's where the landscapers kind of come in, and we'll hopefully be helping you out with getting information to you on that. And then I'm going to kind of finish up on all the other resources we might have that helps you. And what you're getting tonight is a crash course. We are taking what we normally do in 2 days with UNH Cooperative Extension, and we're taking little bits and pieces of that and trying to kind of give you an idea of what it's all about. And we're just sort of planting the seed about what landscapers and homeowners can do about water quality on their property. Normally what we do, and we just finished one up in Sunapee, is we do this 2-day workshop. We have landscapers there. They actually learn about water quality. They go out and they look at a property and they assess it, and then they design things, and then they come back, and then they have more training where they can actually install things. So we're hoping that, you know, this sort of sets the stage for that for you, and that maybe you might be interested in helping to install something and learn about that later on. So to kind of get started with all of this, and I know, and some people here probably already know this concept, but we usually talk about how water flows over land. And to start that conversation, it really starts with the watershed. And if you can kind of visualize a funnel, which is what we think of when we talk about a watershed, and at the bottom of that funnel is the water body, like Lake Wentworth, and then the sides of the funnel are all the land around the lake. And so when it rains or the snow melts and the water kind of goes inside the funnel with that boundary at the top of the funnel, the watershed boundary, then everything that hits the funnel is going to flow down into the water body at the bottom. Then anything that goes outside that funnel, it's still in a watershed. We all live in a watershed, but it's just a different watershed. The other part of watersheds is that this is your Lake Wentworth watershed. It's a lot bigger than the water body, obviously. It's all the area that drains into that water. That's 37 square miles. You also have 11 streams in that watershed, so you actually have these little other watersheds nested inside of it. And then the Lake Wentworth watershed is inside the Lake Winnipesaukee watershed, and then that's in the Merrimack. And then the Merrimack, which drains down to Long Island, is in the Long Island Sound watershed. So we are all connected. So something that happens here in the backyard is going to eventually end up down in Long Island Sound. The other thing to think about is if you kind of go way back in time to maybe elementary school, the water cycle. It's a really nice natural cycle. We have it rains, the water flows downhill, some of it infiltrates into the ground, gets into the water body, some of it evaporates and goes back, and you have this cycle going around and around. And then people come around and they start developing an area. They put all these hard, or what we call impervious surfaces in, the roads, the parking lots, the buildings, rooftops. And if you can kind of imagine what that's doing to that natural cycle, it's really interrupting it. So the other, as long as that's not my phone, it's like, the other thing to think about with this, with the water cycle, is when you have a nice undeveloped area like the forest, and you've got that great canopy up above, and you've got an understory, and then you've got this natural kind of mulch of leaves below, 50% of the water soaks in when it rains. Only 10% of that water is actually flowing off into the stream. The rest is infiltrating in. And then 40% is doing that water cycle with the vegetation and transpiring. And so this is right here. in Wolfeboro, and you're putting in all this impervious surface, these hard surfaces, and that's creating almost a flip of what's happening with the natural cycle. Now only 15% of the water is soaking in, and 55% is running off. It's running off into Lake Winnipesaukee, it's getting into a storm drain, it might go directly in there. It is not soaking in anymore, it's not infiltrating. And then because we don't have as much vegetation, there's a lot less of that natural cycle happening up above. So all this water that's running off these surfaces is what we call stormwater or stormwater runoff. And it can sometimes, stormwater itself will infiltrate, but when it's running off, we call it stormwater runoff, but I'm going to refer to it as stormwater. Some people talk about non-point source pollution. There's a lot of other technical ways to describe it, but we're going to call it stormwater. And as it's running across these surfaces, it's picking up a lot of different pollutants along the way. And if you can think of what's on a roadway, in a parking lot, even on a grassy area where it's compacted, it's picking up oil, grease, it's picking up fertilizer, salt, sand, all kinds of things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we should really care about this. And in New Hampshire, we really expect our water to be clean enough so that the fish will survive, that all the little organisms that they eat will survive. We also expect to be able to go swimming without really worrying about getting sick in our water bodies. And at the Department of Environmental Services, we do a lot of monitoring out there where we're testing water, and you guys do here on the lakes. And what we find is that when a water body doesn't support some of these things that we want it to support, like drinking, fish, or swimming, then we call it that impaired. It's too polluted for what we want to use it for. And there are a lot of impaired waters in New Hampshire, and the sources of that is some of it's coming from stormwater. And does anybody want to guess how much of the pollution is coming from that runoff, that stormwater? Anybody have like a wild guess? A lot? A little? Sorry? 50%, which is a good guess. It's actually, though, it's 90%. So this is a huge issue in New Hampshire. And I'm going to break it down for you to two issues that we kind of are concerned about. The first one is that it's picking up that pollution and carrying it to the water body that I've kind of mentioned. And the other one is that there's too much water because it's not infiltrating into the ground, it's running off. So when you think about water pollution being carried, it could be basically water flowing over a compacted grassy area or flowing right into a water body. It can pick up pollutants along the way. It could be flowing along a roadway, a dirt road, or even a paved road and getting into some sort of trench or swale or something and picking up sediment or dirt along the way. And it could be coming from the nearby parking lot where there's a storm drain and it's picking up all the different types of toxins and pollutants that you have related to cars and trash and things like that, cigarette butts, going into the storm drain. No matter where it's coming from, though, and however it goes, it eventually ends up in a nearby water body untreated. And a lot of people think it's going into a storm drain. There's some sediment maybe if it has catchment for sediment, but the water body is not, the water is not getting treated. So I'll talk about like 4 different causes or sources of pollution that you might want to think about, especially things that are related to landscapers. And the first one would be sediment. And that could be from pretty much any property that has an issue with erosion. Maybe the vegetation's not growing really well. Somebody's come in, they're building a house, there's construction going on, could be a roadway. There's all kinds of different causes of that. And what happens is, it seems like it's harmless, it's dirt, but it is not, because when it gets into the water bodies, it can create a problem with actually making the water very cloudy, makes it difficult for the fish to see, it smothers a lot of their habitat, a lot of the vegetation and the smaller little bugs. The other one is nutrients, and we talk about nutrients as in phosphorus and nitrogen, which is something that landscapers see all the time, and normally that's something that's good because it makes plants grow. We need both phosphorus and nitrogen. But when there's too much that gets into our water bodies, we run into issues with the vegetation kind of taking over. And I'll give you a little demonstration of this. We have phosphorus and nitrogen that could be coming from too much fertilizer, it could be coming from a septic system and things like that. The plants start to grow, and then in the water bodies, they start to grow too much, so you get that problem with algae blooms. It's actually feeding, if you have any problems with invasive species that aren't supposed to be there, it's feeding those a lot more nutrients, cause them to kind of take over, grow like crazy. And then the water's cloudy, doesn't get as much sun, and eventually plants start to die off. And the microorganisms are basically, they're decaying, they're eating all those plants, and so they're taking up the oxygen. And we end up with a depletion of oxygen in the water bodies. And I don't know if anybody here ever seen a fish kill at all? That can be the result of too many of those nutrients getting into water bodies. And because we don't have a lot of time, but I'll briefly explain that where you guys are here in the freshwaters, the nutrient that you're more concerned with is actually the nitrogen, because that's a nutrient that is basically the limiting nutrient. If the plants in the freshwater get a lot of nitrogen or too much nitrogen, then there's a problem with those plants growing. On the coast where we have salt water, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. Oh my gosh. Sorry, it's the other way around, it's phosphorus. I was wondering why you were shaking your head. It's phosphorus, and on the coast it's the nitrogen. I'm sorry, so totally the opposite way. So you here would be more concerned with too much phosphorus. So the other type of pollution that I would be concerned about is bacteria. And again, pet waste, it's wildlife, septic systems, and things like that can cause that. And then the problem with that would be you'd see beach closures. And I think in most of the lakes in New Hampshire, people are seeing that. The other one is toxic contaminants. And so it can be things from like gasoline or spills and too much fertilizer, pesticides, things like that can be creating a problem with toxic contaminants. And then we do see impacts, especially to the aquatic organisms or the frogs and the salamanders are having issues with a lot of the toxics getting into the water and creating problems there. So our lakes, they naturally age. And that happens through a slow process over hundreds of years. And when they have too many nutrients, it speeds up that aging. And it speeds it up really fast. It's not very graceful. And it can happen in decades when there are too many nutrients in our water bodies. So that's the pollution side. And then there's the too much water side of this. And that really is an impact because as it rains, most of you probably noticed our storms are more frequent, they're more severe, we're getting these downfalls that happen very quickly, and then they hit this impervious surface and they don't have an opportunity to kind of soak in. So they're really basically taxing our infrastructure that we build, our stormwater systems, our catch basins, and also the natural infrastructure. And this is Newmarket last October, which was not a very bad storm, and it could not handle it. So we have flooding. We have flooding to the extreme a lot of times where our infrastructure, like our culverts and bridge crossings, aren't big enough to handle them. So it's blowing out or destroying some infrastructure. It causes erosion when there's too much water. And in cases where you have a stream or a river that is near a lot of development and all the water goes to that stream or river at the same time, it becomes very flashy. And that can cause erosion on the banks, and then the sediment goes downstream. It causes problems down there. The trees start to become uprooted. They fall in. They're no longer a nice buffer. You no longer have that shade for all the organisms. It destroys roadways and other infrastructure too, so it's a huge issue. And then the other extreme of it is that we've had droughts in certain parts of the states this past year, and it exacerbates that problem because you no longer are replenishing your groundwater. So this is kind of bringing it down to the home level. This is a typical home. This is kind of, okay, my backyard or whatever. And this gives you an idea of how it works. It rains, the rain hits the roof. You might have gutters, you might not. If you don't have gutters, the rain flows over the roof. It might go over the drip edge, goes down to a pretty compacted lawn, picks up any excess fertilizer. If you do have gutters, it's going to hit that driveway, pick up everything from the car, or maybe from the pet that you have that you didn't pick up the pet waste from. It drains then to the catch basin or directly to a water body. So that's kind of on the micro level. And then this is another example of what happens when people come in and they develop a piece of property. We have this nice undeveloped piece of property. It's nice slope, it's got some nice sandy loam. It hasn't been developed in a long time, hasn't been cut in a long time. And so you don't have to really think about these numbers other than they show you that this is a natural environment. It has the TSS there, the 12 pounds is the sediment, and your phosphorus and nitrogen coming off that property is pretty low. And then they come along and they develop it, and we've got this very long driveway, a lot of impervious surface, a big house, and a nice maintained lawn, but now we are basically creating much more runoff, much more of the sediment is coming off 5 times, 16 times on the phosphorus, and 7 times on the nitrogen. And then you look at it from more of the the bigger picture here, where we have Concord. And this is kind of a pretty urban area. And you see a lot of impervious surface. And it's like, what's the point? You know, we have all this impervious surface, and how are we going to make a difference here? And with our program with Soak Up the Rain, we kind of look at this and we think, well, the point is that there's also a lot of space here to infiltrate that water and clean it up before it gets into the water bodies nearby, and to kind of reduce the amount of pollution coming off the property. So it's kind of a more optimistic view of how to look at it. So I think, Lisa, I think you're up next. So I don't know if you have any questions. Lisa's going to talk about that next step for you on what to do and how to do it. Yes, Jack.
Early on, you referred to sediment as dirt.
Right.
Is there some dirt that's worse than others, more of a problem than?
Yeah, and you probably can answer this more than anybody, but and one thing I forgot to mention is the other problem with sediment is too that it will pick up a lot of the different pollutants that are out there. So a lot of those toxic pollutants that we have, it's a pathway to get into our water bodies. So it will carry a lot of the different things that we're concerned about in addition to the nutrients and things like that. But there's things like roadway sediment, which would have certain types of, maybe have some chloride in it. So that's another thing that we worry about too on that end. So I don't know, are you thinking of something specifically?
No, there's pockets of clay around
Okay.
this area. There's great pockets of sand. Is one a little more harmful than the other?
Well, the clay's going to have more nutrients in it probably, but other than that, I don't know, to be honest, if it's going to be worse than the others. I think it depends on what else is in it. And I would think the clay would be worse, so. But do you have a feeling for that? Okay. Okay, thanks. Any other questions? Other than, here you go. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about site scale, what we call site scale stormwater management. As Barb said, this Soak Up the Rain is a residential stormwater management program. It's a voluntary program where, you know, even though it's a DES program, that it's outreach and education. And so I'll walk you through the 10 stormwater solutions. On the back table, you'll see the New Hampshire Homeowner's Guide to Stormwater Management. And in addition to telling you why it's a good idea to do this type of thing, as Barb just went through, there's 10 what we call stormwater solutions in there, like rain gardens and rain barrels, and there's step-by-step instructions on how to install each one of those, as well as instructions onto how to look at your property to figure out if it would be a good candidate for one of these practices, and how to choose a solution. So I'm going to go through those ideas with you a little bit right now. There's 10 practices, as I mentioned. 6 of them are what we call infiltration practices, so they're meant to direct water into these practices so that it can slowly soak into the ground. So, for example, a drip line infiltration trench, and I'll tell you that most of these are not newfangled, innovative ideas. They're things that have been around for a long time. We're just trying to bring them out to the public. So a drip line infiltration trench is simply a stone-filled trench around the perimeter of a building. You can see there that it's dug down, so there's a sub-base where the water can move down and then slowly sink in. You wouldn't want to put one of these maybe next to a building that has a basement because the water might try to migrate into the basement. You can put a perforated pipe in the bottom of it so the water moves out of it, moves away to some place where it can infiltrate, and that's part of the instructions that you would see in the booklet. If you were to see one, it might just look like a splash guard kind of thing, but if there's a sub-base under there, it's trying to be an infiltration device. A similar is a driveway infiltration trench, so that if your driveway is crowned such that the water sheds off and runs down the edges, you could capture that water so it doesn't run down the road, as Barb was saying earlier. This is an example of one that we partnered with Phillips Exeter Academy to work with their students on Climate Action Day. I think that was 2016 or 17. So there was water coming onto this driveway and moving down the hill there and into the Squamscott River. And we worked with the students. There's an infiltration trench on 2 sides. There's 3/4 inch clean drainage stone under there, and then we topped it with a decorative stone. A dry well is something you're probably all familiar with. You can see in this picture that we're illustrating capturing roof runoff with the downspout coming in, and we hook it up to 4-inch corrugated pipe and run it into the dry well so it can slowly sink in. We did one of these on a project in Greenland with our partner Soak Up the Rain Great Bay, where we put in 10 practices with them. They had a grant through the state, and one of them was a dry well on a property. You dig a hole, you line it with textile fabric to prevent soil from migrating in and taking up the pore space, and so the water can move in there. In this version of the guide, we tried to add how to add, we did add how to enhance these practices wherever we could with vegetation. You can plant on top of a dry well. There are instructions in there that tell you to put a layer of that fabric, some soil for a planting bed, and then to plant on top of it. So you're treating the stormwater, but you're also beautifying your property and adding the ecological benefits of native plants. If you were to use native plants, you could be adding pollinating plants and stuff like that. Infiltration steps are a great stormwater solution for sloped areas where you have water washing down and eroding, especially toward a lake. We were able to put in a set of these with our partners Soak Up the Rain Silver Lake out in Harrisville, where water was coming. In this photo, you're standing at the top of the hill, and the lake is way down there in the background. So we put these in sort of 2 phases. That's the top set that went toward a porch, and we put in a landing, and now you're standing at the bottom of the hill and looking back up. So there was water just tearing around. You can see on that bottom picture that it's sloped up there, and the water obviously was moving toward the lake. So these are built with, I think it's 6x6 timbers, and they're pinned in with rebar and then backfilled again with that 3/4 inch clean stone. So the water can infiltrate instead of just tearing down and eroding. Porous pavers are any types of paver that have a stone reservoir underneath so that the water can move through the pavers. There's no grout or anything between the pavers, so water can move through them, between them, and get down. You can see that there's a subbase again under there for water to move in, to be stored up, and then slowly move in. Anything from plain concrete pavers to something more decorative, and I think there's a guy in the back there that's got lots of different types to show you. Rain gardens are the big deal right now. Have any of you put in rain gardens with clients or at your house, or have you had interest in them? Any landscapers have had clients saying, do you know what a rain garden is? Well, a rain garden is basically a perennial garden that is sunken down below grade. The water is directed into it so it can slowly soak into the ground. This is a picture of one that we did in Greenland. I have a little graphic and then a picture of that. So the key feature to a rain garden is really that ponding area that I mentioned. You can see there is the top of the grade. You can see the grass there, so that's the original grade. And there's the top of my garden, so there's space between there. Along comes a storm, and that rain garden fills up. And then as the storm passes and the sun comes out, that water slowly soaks into the ground. Other than that, I mean, there's some features like the inlet and an overflow outlet, but you can put not ordinary perennials, but they can have common perennials in there. We worked with Cooperative Extension to develop a rain garden plant list, which is on the back table. So if that's something you're interested in, be sure to get one of those. This is that rain garden I showed you a minute ago. My little sun graphic there got left over, but this rain garden we put in, again, with our Soak Up the Rain Great Bay partner. The day after we built it, we had a big storm, which seems to happen a lot to us. And I don't know if you can pick it up, but that rain garden filled all the way up. You can see on the right-hand side there how dark the mulch is. That rain garden filled all the way up, and this is the next day where it's slowly soaking into the ground. So they're a great feature. Of course, they do need maintenance. All of these types of practices need some sort of maintenance or another, and that's addressed, again, in the homeowner's guide. We certainly write about that. So those are the 6 infiltration practices. Like I said, they're meant specifically to direct the water right to them. But sometimes you don't have a place where you can infiltrate the water, but you need to do something about it. You don't like where it's running. So there's 4 additional practices that are for collecting it or directing it or otherwise trying to help out somehow. For example, the good old-fashioned rain barrel. Just to capture it and store it for later, or put a hose on it and direct it to where you want. This is a project we did again with Soak Up the Rain Great Bay, where we had a roof. The big dig on rain barrels is they fill up really quickly. Less than 100 square feet of roof with 1 inch of rain falling on it will fill up a rain barrel really quickly. So in this case, the homeowner was able to split the gutters so they went in 2 different directions, and we put rain barrels at each end. But I made a really ugly graphic to show you the idea of daisy chaining together, which is a way to increase capacity. So you could put rain gardens next to each other and hook them up so that as the first one overflows, it dumps into the second one, and so on. So it just gives you can use that same simple device, but increase the capacity just by adding rain barrels and connecting them together. Water bars, I think, are so cool. I love putting these in. Therefore, again, a sloped area, not super steep, but you may see these. If you go out hiking, you'll see them on trails or at camps where you have a slope in maybe a high use area, and the water is slowly making its way down. This is the type one type we put in at Camp Robin Hood up in Lake Ossipee, where the water, you put them at an angle on the slope, so as the water comes down. I should also say that behind the bar there, you dig a trench and fill that with that same 3/4 inch stone. So as the water comes down, it hits the bar, collects in that trench area, and then moves off into a vegetated area. You can see they're done in a series. I think we put 5 in there. This is a really interesting type called a rubber razor. Unfortunately, we don't have directions for this in our homeowner's guide, but the Portland, Maine Water District has a great instructional guide for these. You take a section of repurposed supermarket conveyor belt material, you sandwich it between 2, in this case we use 2x6s, so that you can see the black that's sticking up there, that's the conveyor belt material. So you sandwich it in there and you bury it so just the material is sticking up. And that way the water, again, it comes down, it hits that bar, moves off to the side into a vegetated area through that trench. But the rubber razor is there both to catch the water, but it's also nice because you can drive over it with bicycles or golf carts or maintenance trucks. One thing about water bars, though, is you can't use them on roads that are plowed because you'll just tear them up. But they're great, especially for wide areas of heavy use where steps, it's just too stretched out to put steps in, for example. A vegetated swale is simply a channel that moves water along, but you put plants in it. We've all seen swales and ditches along the sides of the roads, but if you can put some plants in there, they help collect, they make pockets where water can collect and get absorbed by the plant or soak in. This is a vegetated swale that was put in through our 319 program. It was a different type of program, but still a stormwater management program, where they added, as you can see, big riprap to create check dams, and you're all probably familiar with what they do. They help the water builds up behind the check dam, where some of the sediment can settle out, the water can maybe soak in a big storm. Again, they're done in a series, so the water maybe fills up behind one, overflows, goes behind the other. Meanwhile, the vegetation is doing its job to pick up pollutants and soak up water. A vegetated buffer is simply an area of vegetation between your landscaped area and the water body. So as Barb mentioned, lawns, a lot of people think, well, I have this big lawn and it's going to soak up water. After a little while, lawns can become compacted and shed water. I'm sure some of you have seen that, water just running off your lawn. So, but between any type of landscaped area and the water body, a layer of vegetation is a great thing to have. This is a natural buffer. We like to see people leave air, like that picture that Barb showed you where they had developed with that big green lawn. If you notice, there was almost no vegetation at the edge. But if you leave some vegetation there at the edge, you make a buffer, a protective layer between the landscape and the lake. And if there is none, you can add one. You can see there's a nice green lawn there, but there are plants that were added in. There's a pathway there, a gravel pathway, so you can still have access to your lake. You can use nice low-growing plants. They don't have to be giant shrubs and trees, so you can still have your view. So those are the 10 stormwater solutions that we promote and try to install through our program. And I just want to take a couple minutes to tell you how we look at sites and decide if it's a good candidate. So we do what we call follow the flow. Where's the water coming from? Where is it going to? And are there problems that it causes along the way or wherever it gets to? And can we turn those problems into opportunities, like Barb showed you that picture of Concord where there are all those green spaces? We use those opportunities to put in some of these types of practices. But our number one question is always, will the soil soak up the rain? So we'll talk a little bit about that too. This is a house in Hampton. We worked with the Hampton Conservation Commission for a couple of years. They had a program where they were finding places to put in rain gardens. So this is a house that we went to and visited with them. This house has lots of gutters and downspouts at every corner, and we put our particular attention on that downspout in the back where the truck is parked, because we noticed that one. Well, let me go back one more. Most of these on the front were going into a grassy area and the water was being somewhat soaked up. It didn't seem like a big problem. But here it was running down the driveway out into the road, and we asked, is there a problem? Well, yes, it was picking up that sediment and those other types of pollutants that Barb was talking about, dirt, oil, grease, maybe some toxic stuff from vehicles, going into that catch basin and dumping into the little river right behind it. So for us, that was a fantastic opportunity. That's that same downspout in the corner. We hit it with a little vegetation, but we added some piping there and turned that downspout to go toward the lawn. We buried it, and we had it go into a rain garden. So now, instead of that water running down into the road, it's collected in this beautiful garden and soaked in. This is, again, a project we did with Soak Up the Rain Great Bay, where this house was receiving runoff from a little bit from the road, from their big driveway. And this is the garage down there at the bottom of the photo there, where that water that's coming down the driveway was joining. You can see peeking out from the bushes there right next to the garage. There's a downspout. So roof water, too, was joining, moving across in front of that garage and going into this grate. And we opened it up and said, what's going on here? Again, just following that flow. And we found that pipe, if you can see that little pipe in the bottom of that grate. And that was hooked to a pipe out back that was dumping all this water into this pond that overflowed into Great Bay. And if any of you know Great Bay, that has pollution problems of its own. So for us, again, that was an opportunity. And you can see there in the, I don't know if this pointer works, but you can see the white pipe there. That's the beginning of that overflow, that pipe that went out to the pond. So we directed the water past that and into a dry well. We dug the dry well, lined it with the fabric like I was mentioning, and then we put this overflow pipe in it so that any overflow from once the dry well fills up in a larger storm, it'll still go out to that pond, but meanwhile we've caught a whole bunch of it and we're soaking it up. And then we stand there and we be very proud of ourselves and have somebody take our picture because we feel like we're doing good things. This is the camp I mentioned, Camp Robin Hood at Lake Ossipee. This was a area, you're standing on top of the hill where there was some lodging, and there was this big path that people used in golf carts and the kids, and they would go down. There's another lodging building there, right at the top of the picture. You can see a little bit of white there. This stormwater was just tearing down this hill, wrapping around the building, and coming around the corner, and again, tearing down. They had some sort of steps there. I don't have the full picture. And heading down toward the lake. You can see they took a downed tree that was on the property to put it across there to try to block it off. So we thought, wow, this is not only a great opportunity to do something about the stormwater, but it was a great opportunity to work with the campers. We partnered with the Green Mountain Conservation Group. She facilitated this project, and we worked with the campers and counselors to rehab. That's where the water was coming around the corner. I didn't show you that very well, but there were some steps there that were just filled with sand and muck and pine needles, so we cleaned those out and retrofitted some stormwater, some infiltration steps. So that left-hand photo is that hill that I showed you at first, and those are the set of water bars we put in. And then we put the infiltration steps along the side there to capture more of the stormwater that was coming around. I think I have. So also, this is an idea that Barbara mentioned to you about the green lawns and how the fertilizer and pet waste, and even the grass clippings themselves, if you mow the lawn and they end up near a catch basin or getting washed into a water body, as that grass dies, it releases the nutrients that it was using to keep itself alive into your water body, so you're fertilizing the water body wherever those grass clippings go. But also you can imagine if there's pets here or any other types of pesticides, they could be washing right into that pond, enhancing. And I understand that you have milfoil in Wentworth, so the fertilizer not only will cause overgrowth of the native vegetation, your natural pond weeds, but also of those invasive species like milfoil. So if you have overgrowth and algae, as Barbara mentioned, can have algae blooms in ponds and lakes. And I always say green lawn, green pond, because we just see it over and over again. So real quickly, I also want to say that when we decide, okay, we see a problem, an opportunity, but we want to know if the soil will soak up the rain. So there's 3 types of tests that we do. The first is a simple perk test, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. We dig a hole, we fill it up. We usually let it drain out once and we fill it up again just so we make sure we get a really good test. And especially for a rain garden, you want that a 12-inch deep hole to drain within 24 hours. The other types of infiltration practices, of course, you could have a slower infiltration rate, but you want to make sure the soils will soak up the rain. If that hole just has water in it for days and days, then you don't want to put an infiltration practice in there. A soil ribbon test is another test that you can do. You just get a handful of that soil, enough so it'll stick together, and you try to squeeze out a ribbon between your thumb and forefinger. A sandy soil won't make a ribbon, and that's good news for infiltration. If you can make a big long ribbon with that, you've got clay in that soil, and it's not going to be very good for infiltration. So you need to think twice about putting infiltration practice in there. You could use one of the other types of practices, but maybe not in infiltration. This I recently added. I call it the soggy test. Is it soggy? Is it squishy? Is it spongy? Because a lot of times you'll have people that think wet areas are great places for rain gardens, and they absolutely are not. You want to put rain gardens in places where the water will move in and soak in, not where it will stay wet. So if at any time of year, for any number of days, an area stays soggy, squishy, or spongy, just say no to infiltration because it's not the right thing. And you have to excuse me, but I'm going to drive this point home because we seem to have, if you have a client that says, why do I have a puddle in my yard days after the rain has stopped? Is that a great place for a rain garden? Say no. And we had this problem, actually, somebody that went through this type of training. They tried to put a rain garden in a place where it really shouldn't have gone, and the property owner called us to help them figure out what to do. You can see, I don't have a pointer here. Oh, right behind this rain garden, 10 feet away, there was a wetland. So not only your soggy, squishy, spongy test, your infiltration test, your soil ribbon test, if you look around and see purple loosestrife or cattails or something, you know you're near a wetland, and you probably do not want to try to put any kind of rain garden or any other infiltration device in there. So use the test, use your common sense, just look around and talk to people and feel it out. Because there was muck in the bottom of this hole, and it could not be a rain garden. I have completely lost track of how long I've been talking, so I'll just quickly go through. Of course, there's a lot more that we look at a site, all kinds of site constraints, like the property setbacks, and is it a right-of-way, and can you work in there? Underground utilities, we always call DigSafe, even if we're working with a homeowner that says, I've lived here all my life, I know what's under there. You have to call if you're going to dig a hole, because you just don't want to have a problem. So you want to stay away from wells and septic tanks. Look for signs of big roots or big rocks that might impede your digging of a hole. Certain practices need to be on certain types of slopes or not. Of course, if you're going to plant, think about your sun and shade. So there's lots that goes into it. And of course, what does the property owner want? What are their preferences? If you don't want to plant a rain garden where nobody wants to maintain it, if you're a landscaper, maybe it's a great way to get some business. We'll put in this rain garden, we'll come back twice a year and take care of it for you. So, of course, we don't expect you to memorize everything or have taken lots of notes and learned everything, so we encourage you to pick up one of those homeowners' guides to stormwater management in the back. We also have this website, soaknh.org, or just look up Soak Up the Rain, New Hampshire. There is an EPA Soak Up the Rain program where they encourage these same types of things. It is a DES program, and if any of you have ever been on the DES website, it's not that beautiful or that easy to navigate, but this website is completely different and unique. It's a very user-friendly, very robust website of its own. And we have things like these flow charts that will help you go through to pick one of these practices by answering a series of questions. And there's tons of resources on there. If you wanted to look at somebody's yard and do that follow the flow kind of thing that I just did, there's a field packet in there that tells you how to look at a house. It walks you through, look at the roof, the walkway, the yard, what's happening. So many resources on there. And I think from here, Barbara is going to take over and talk a little bit more about the website. And should I pause for questions? Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm just going to finish up, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions if there is time. As Lisa mentioned, we do have a website, so if you sat through this and you have questions or you need more information, please go to our website because we have all kinds of tools there. We also work with Cooperative Extension to help with designs, so they actually will review designs with us and make recommendations, so it's a really good tool. We do more trainings, and we actually will go out and help some of our partners do installation. So we're there with tools, equipment, and we have a lot of lessons learned that we can share with people. And the other thing that we have in our guide is good housekeeping tips, and we don't have a lot of time to go over those today, but those really do relate to landscaping and landscapers. Some of them are, for everybody, like, keep your car tuned up because then you have less oil and grease coming out of it. Where to wash your car. The best place to wash your car is actually at the car wash for water quality because the water's getting treated there. Looking at the whole, basically your property holistically as sort of almost conservation aspects of it, having a little less lawn and having more nice ground cover or other native species, planting those on your property, more trees. The value of a tree is really tremendous as far as for cleaning up water quality. You have the canopy, you have the root system, it's really, really precious. And then your downspouts, putting those towards vegetation. Lisa mentioned that earlier. Another thing with landscaping is where to put those yard clippings and the leaf waste. Don't put it on the roadway, don't put it on the stream bank, don't put it in a stream or near a water body. The grass clippings can be a very valuable resource as far as the fertilizer on your lawn. The data that they have of how much fertilizer a lawn would need decreases by about 50% if you leave the grass clippings on the lawn. And then the big one that comes up a lot of times is winter maintenance. And I just wanted to know how many of you actually do some plowing or shoveling in the wintertime as part of your business? So have any of you heard of the Green Snow Pro program? Has anybody heard of that? We have that because this is a big issue in New Hampshire, and especially it's happening everywhere, but we have a lot of water bodies now that are actually impaired from chloride. There is too much chloride in those water bodies for the fish to survive and the organisms to survive. And we found that when we did data on that and a lot of research is that parking lots, private parking lots are a big source. The highways, the municipal roads, but the private parking lots and driveways can be quite a contributor. So there's a program out there called Green Snow Pro, which is a certification program for people that do winter maintenance. You have to keep the safety as your priority, but you can minimize the amount of chloride and salt that you're putting down by being more efficient and more effective and learning some of those techniques that are out there. And the benefit is that you actually get decreased liability. Because you are certified, and if you show that you're doing the practices the way you're supposed to, then you are protected on your liability more than you would be. So we're really condensing a lot in here, and we're not able to go into a lot of things that some of you might be interested in, which is with turf management and fertilizer and some of the really great practices out there that there's a lot of science now behind what you can do to reduce the amount of fertilizer and what type of fertilizer you need, if you need any phosphorus, nitrogen, slow release, all those kind of things. We have a ton more information on that. And I strongly recommend you take the training. I have a sheet here. We do the training about once a year in different parts of the state with UNH Cooperative Extension, and there is a certification that you get listed on their website as having taken the training. That's a little bit more than what you are getting today, and it's just really a great opportunity. So I will pass out a sheet. If you want to learn when the next one is, we'll put you on the list to be notified. So we do want to try to get an installation out of this. So if you think your property or you are working with somebody that has a property that you might want to put a rain garden in, could you, I guess, talk to Ann? Really?
Direct it to our office.
Yeah.
Take my card, and we will give them to the DES folks and maybe pick an ideal site where we can learn with hands-on.
And then we can let everybody here know that we're going to do it, and if anybody wants to come to it and help us, but also we can walk through and teach you how to do it. And we also have a video of doing an installation on our website, which does that kind of process for you too. So I don't, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
No, just get in touch, and then we'll work with Barbara on it.
So just get in touch with Ann. So are there any questions for Lisa and I at this point? Yes.
You're both DES. Some of what you're describing are homeowner options, but there are also town roads and culverts and water being sort of managed by the town. What's the
So the program that Lisa and I are from is the Watershed Assistance, or the Section 319 program, which is a grant program. You guys have a grant right now with us, I think, for the. Yeah, and our goal on that end was to handle like the Winnipesaukee by sub-watersheds. So that is the intention. So there's other projects going on too. So as far as funding. And then as far as information, there is the UNH Stormwater Center, which works a lot with municipalities too, on different practices, because it is different when you're talking about a municipality. It's a whole different level, and there's a lot of different barriers to doing something within a town. So it's a good question. Yes, in the back?
Two questions for you. One, is an organic fertilizer okay to use on the lawn? And two, once you install these dry wells or rain gardens, do you recommend to the landlord a certain maintenance schedule for them?
Those are good questions. The first one, UNH Cooperative Extension are the experts on with the organic fertilizer and what's the best to use. There are pros and cons with this, because organic is great. You're building up the soil, making it healthier. And the problem that we run into is where you are in the lakes area, most of the organic fertilizers, especially compost and things like that, have a lot of phosphorus in them. So that it's sort of a balance. You have to make sure that your situation is so that it won't run into the lakes. But that would be really, if you kind of interested in that, UNH Cooperative Extension has a lot more information on that. So, and the second question? Yeah, Lisa, you can.
The homeowner's guide tells you about maintenance. It says you after a large storm, check this and that once a year, do this and that. So there are maintenance guidelines for each of those stormwater solutions in that homeowner's guide.
So.
Is there a clearinghouse for encouraging cooperation between homeowners? Homeowners' plot is so small that one person's solution is going to be another person's problem. And listening to your talk, I heard a lot of things not to do, but then not what to do with the stuff that I mean, if you're collecting dog waste, what's the best way to dispose of it? You just send it out to the dump, or do you mix it with sawdust and put it in a corner, or do you, so on and so forth? If you don't have an infiltrate, if you have soil that's dark down and not appropriate for infiltration, you drain it. Where do you drain it to? How do you cooperate with adjoining parcels?
Yeah, I mean, those are good questions, because there's always kind of those extending circumstances. And with the pet waste, I mean, normally, depending on the area, we recommend that you actually put it does go to the landfill. But then there are situations where maybe if you're not near a water source, a drinking water source, a groundwater source, you could bury it and do like a composting. But you do have to be a distance away from the surface waters and the groundwater to do that. But we can talk more, because we have a whole big program on pet waste, on recommendations for that. Because we found a lot of people were picking up and putting in their plastic bags and then just leaving the plastic bags or the pet waste there. So we did a lot of research on what was the best way to handle that. So, but I don't want to take up any, I don't know how you want to do this with
I think we can capture more questions at the end. We want to give everybody a break, because you've been really, really attentive. And I also want to make one comment, just to make sure that Wentworth isn't the only place that has milfoil. Every lake has milfoil, and many of your tax dollars are going into milfoil mitigation in Back Bay. So it's everybody's problem. It's not, it's a big big issue that we're all facing. So how about a 10-minute break? So that brings us back at 20 after. Those of you that are landscape professionals in different realms of landscaping, if you pick up this information card, we're going to bring some through the audience. We will put your name on the Wentworth Watershed Association website for people to check in and say, oh, they went to that. I'm going to talk to them because I know they can do a rain garden or a filtration system of some sort. So if you need one of these cards, raise your hand. Susan will give you one. On the other side of this card, for all of you, we'd love your comments because your comments make our programs better. It's your comments at the Water Summit last year that brought us to this point. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over Jay, and maybe he'll have questions in the interim, and then we'll wrap up with questions. I will repeat the questions so that everybody can hear them. I got that comment. So thank you. Jay Aubie.
Good evening, everybody. All right, well, we switched up the order. We figured this presentation has a lot to do with environmental law, so we wanted to give you an opportunity to have a little more beer, make it a little more make it a bit more painless for you. No, it's actually not painless at all. So again, my name is Jay Aubie. I've been at DES now for, a little over 10 years. I've given hundreds of these presentations around the state on the Shoreline Protection Act. As you can remember, maybe back in 2008, the Shoreline Protection Act at that time really garnered a lot of attention when a new permitting process took effect. Tonight's presentation will really just go over the nuts and bolts of the Shoreline Protection Act with an emphasis on how it relates directly to our landscaping professionals as well. A lot of what I'm going to talk about here it ties in nicely in terms of what Barb and Lisa presented to you a few moments ago. But like I do with every presentation, regardless of what law we're talking about, maybe it's a federal law, state law, or a local ordinance, it's great to just take a step back and think about what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to capture? What is the law trying to achieve? So I think it's good just to take a moment here, just a couple minutes, and take a look at the Shoreline Protection Act and ask ourselves, what are we trying to accomplish? What are we doing here? Still, to this date, I feel that still a lot of folks feel that the Shoreline Protection Act is just a law out there that has an interest in saving trees. And the law goes much further than that and really ties in to stormwater management as well. So here we go. Put your thinking caps on for a second. We're going to talk about the Shoreline Protection Act, the minimum standards. I'm going to touch upon pervious surfaces. Barb talked about those a bit. We're going to look at the shoreline permitting process, and I'll touch quickly on erosion controls as well. So let's jump right into the Shoreline Protection Act purpose, the intent of the law. Hey, once upon a time, a water body is just inhabited by Native Americans, and we arrived here and then started to install dams and raise the level of our water bodies. And the point here is that when you look at many of the water bodies, they were predominantly vegetated. The shorelines were primarily vegetated. Nothing but large trees and natural ground covers. Even here in 19 Mile Bay, Lake Winnipesaukee, these old photos you can see highly vegetated shorelines. Old photo of Lake Wentworth here. And here, notice really the lack of structures, larger homes and structures and impervious areas along the shorelines. Here's Point Breeze, Lake Wentworth as well. Great shots, huh? Where's Beach Laconia? Even this area was vegetated. And here is a common small cottage on Suncook Lake down in Barnstead. And what we saw in the 80s, the mid-80s, is we started to see a lot of structures like this, a lot of folks coming in and taking these cottages, these old cabins. The second home market was booming, and folks were coming in and taking these old cottages and then converting them into more year-round residential dwellings like this here. Now, the take-home point is that big houses are bad. That's not what I'm trying to say here. What we're showing here is that there was a shift. There was a change in behaviors, and when folks were coming in and bringing in a lot of these behaviors and lawns, et cetera, that you'd see in typical urban and suburban environments, and they were putting them here in our rural areas of New Hampshire along our water bodies. And after that, shortly after, we were literally rolling out these new behaviors and situations on our shorelands, we started to see a real decrease in water quality. And what Barb and Lisa pointed out so nicely is that whenever you increase impervious area, all those surfaces that can't absorb and infiltrate stormwater, and you eliminate areas of natural vegetation, you see a decrease in water quality, because now you're increasing the likelihood of the stormwater to enter or directly discharge into your lakes and ponds. Stormwater, stormwater, stormwater is your greatest threat to your water quality today. When we look more closely at this area here, you can see it's been what we call carved up a bit. There's impervious areas and structures. We'll zoom in and look more closely at this region here, and you can see that the shoreline has indeed been altered. Here are the gravel driveways. Technically, they're considered to be impervious. They can absorb a very light rain event, but during a storm event, there's sheet flow. There's stormwater racing across those surfaces. So when you have a major, maybe front rip through, and you have that intense rainfall, there's stormwater racing off those surfaces, directly discharging in our surface waters, especially over those regions where the impervious area extends right down to the water's edge, and regions like this here, where the natural ground covers have been removed and it was converted to a lawn. So what the Shoreline Protection Act is looking to achieve is to recognize those areas of our water bodies where we do have well-vegetated regions and retain them to the best we can, and also restore those regions where we have impacted already. Look at all the shade that these trees provide over these inshore waters. Barbara was talking earlier, and Lisa was talking about earlier about how by providing shade over those inshore waters, milfoil is less apt to get established. Milfoil is not really a shade-tolerant species. It needs lots of sun to survive. Here's a fantastic, what we call a waterfront buffer, lots of natural vegetation within that first 50 feet. That's that real critical zone where the law is looking to retain those natural ground covers. Here's an area of a property that was restored. It was once a lot of lawn, a maintained area right down to the water's edge. A fair amount of restoration went into this site here. Here's an excellent site where they put in some additional vegetation to achieve greater levels of infiltration, more shade over the water's edge. In general, just more of an environmentally friendly situation. So that's really the science and the intent of the Act. I hope if there's anything you walk away with today, you have a better understanding that the Shoreline Protection Act isn't just looking to save trees, it's really looking at to maintain and restore vegetated buffers. It's looking to better manage our stormwater and provide some of the critical wildlife habitat that trees and natural vegetation provide along the shoreline. So now we'll get into the law itself and how the law actually achieves these things. We'll take a look at the minimum standards. Here's the Shoreline Protection Act. Now be mindful that this has existed since 1994. It became effective in 94. It was enacted in 1991. Here is the protected shoreline is always extended 250 feet from the water's edge. There's the 50-foot primary structure setback here, the first 50 feet. The limits on vegetation removal extend to 150 feet landward. Here's the real critical zone, that first 50 feet. It's called the waterfront buffer. This zone right here, that's where the law is really trying to retain those regions of the properties where there is natural ground cover left intact and achieve some restoration when it can. So here's the waterfront buffer. If a property owner, developer, or landscaper has an interest in removing trees today, this is how it works. These are the limitations on tree removal. You divide the property up from the most northerly or easterly property boundary, always starting again from the most northerly or easterly property boundary. Then you divide the waterfront buffer up into these 25 by 50-foot grid segments, just like this. Score the trees based on their diameter. Trees with a diameter of 1 to 3 inches are given a score of 1 point, 3 to 6 inches, 5 points. All trees 6 to 12 inches give a score of 10 points, and all trees greater than a foot in diameter are given a score of 15 points. If a property owner or developer has an interest in removing trees within any grid segment, they take a look at that grid segment, they score up the trees. Trees can be removed, provided that when the cutting is completed, at least 25 points of trees and saplings remains within each grid segment. Here's a grid segment here that I quickly flagged out. There are two 50 by 25-foot grid segments. You score the trees, remove trees. If this view didn't suffice, trees technically could be removed, provided that 25 points can remain. Here's the woodland buffer area. Just wanted to speak to this limitation here. The natural woodland buffer is this zone between 50 and 150 here. Technically, 25% of this region needs to remain in an unaltered state, meaning untouched, pretty much allowed to grow relatively uninhibited. Just general maintenance, trimming and pruning certainly is permissible. But the law is looking to have some region between this zone here to at least remain untouched. The law also recognizes that there are a slew of properties out there that may not have any area today that exists in an unaltered state. It may be completely structures, driveways, impervious surfaces, and lawn. And the law is very clear in that those areas, technically today, if they can continue to be maintained as they have historically. They're grandfathered. There's no provision in the law that requires additional plantings occur to achieve that 25% minimum. So there's 25% here. Most folks through the shoreline permitting process today elect to do it in this fashion here. If you have a raw, undeveloped lot, you're putting in a new home, you allow along the property lines 2 regions to remain untouched and unaltered. It allows for a better view of the surface water and allows for privacy from your abutters and neighbors. So here's another look again at that unaltered state requirement between 50 and 150. Here's the zone of the property between 50 and 150. It's important when we look at this piece of property here that it's largely composed of lawn, but there are 2 small fragments in there that do exist in an unaltered state. There's trees, there's some natural ground covers in there. So it's not completely altered. It doesn't meet the 25% minimum, but there is some there. The take-home point here is that because there is some, it means you can't further reduce it below what you already have. Let's say this is only 10%. Technically, 10% here may exist in an unaltered state. If this property owner, developer, or landscaper wanted to come in and put in some new features, some new walkways, patios, maybe a detached garage, very permissible. You just do so in a way that you don't build out structures into those areas that currently do exist in an unaltered state. When the plans come into DES, those regions are shown on the plan, like this here. There they are, between 50 and 150. Those are the 2 regions that I just showed you that exist in an unaltered state. This fact sheet is available on the Shoreland Program website. It's a comprehensive fact sheet document, or publication rather, that helps explain these limitations on tree removal. Just wanted to move into impervious surface limitations. If you recall in the presentation before mine, they really touched on the need to address impervious surfaces, especially when we have impervious surfaces so close to water bodies. Again, impervious surfaces have that natural tendency to concentrate and direct and channel stormwater to our surface waters. So the Shoreline Protection Act looks to get a better handle of some of these impervious areas, their location, and when you exceed certain thresholds or certain quantities or certain areas of impervious area, the law mandates that certain pieces of stormwater management be implemented. Definition of impervious surface is any modified surface that has been that cannot effectively absorb and infiltrate stormwater. So like I said earlier, even a gravel driveway technically is considered impervious area. Roofs, decks, patios, walkways, paved gravel, crushed stone driveways, landscaping features, patios, walkways, they're often impervious unless specifically designed to infiltrate stormwater. And I'll touch on that in just a second. So looking overhead at this lot here, the impervious surface area of this lot within the protected shoreline, zoom in more closely, is the rooftop. That can't absorb the stormwater. It's the deck too, unless it's really designed to infiltrate stormwater down below it. And it's the gravel parking area out here. Those are the impervious areas of this lot within the protected shoreline. Now what the law says is, okay, you're going to develop a lot within the protected shoreline. There are these impervious area thresholds. If more than 20% of your lot is going to be impervious, some things have to happen. If you take it a step further, and more than 30% of your lot is going to be impervious, some additional things have to happen, including some restoration. So I'll address each of these really quickly here. If it's a project and you're proposing an increase in impervious area, whether it be a raw lot or maybe it's an existing lot and there's a proposal to maybe expand an existing home, maybe expand a parking area, maybe build a detached garage, and you're going to push your impervious area over 20%, the law says you have to incorporate a stormwater management system to infiltrate that stormwater associated with development. I know just the town of Wolfeboro itself has a local ordinance on stormwater. It's actually a bit more stringent than the state law. So how do you do this? Stormwater management, what the heck is that? Lisa touched on a number of ways in which that can be done. A rain garden was one of them. Look at the water body in the background there. This is directing the stormwater from the driveway into this rain garden. There it is in action, slowing down the water, intercepting it, and infiltrating it. Rain gardens here, taking the downspout, directing the water to a rain garden, dry wells, drainage swales. You don't have to be, it's not really an engineering marvel here, you're just regrading and redirecting water so that you can slow it down and have the land absorb it. Feed the vegetation on land, don't feed the aquatic vegetation in the water. Again, these drainage swales here, an infiltration trench at the drip line of the house, designed in a way that it can absorb that stormwater and get it into the ground. Here are some rain bars on this site, directing the stormwater to the vegetated areas along the property lines, keeping it away from the beach area below. Here's a site in Barnstead where these folks expanded the size of the home. You can see the expansion area down below. You have a steep drop down this gravel driveway, largely impervious. This project went over the 20% threshold. Down below here, a large portion of that stormwater from the gravel driveway and from that rooftop gets directed into this little depression area here. Any spillover drops down into the vegetated area in the background. As Barbara mentioned earlier, there's this tremendously useful publication entitled The New Hampshire Homeowner's Guide to Stormwater Management. I believe there are copies in the back if you're interested in installing any of these features on your properties. There's also this document here available through the UNH Cooperative Extension, Landscaping at the Water's Edge. Moving back onto impervious surfaces, let's say it's a larger project, larger scale project in a way that you're going to develop the site in a way that upon completion of the project, more than 30% of the lot within the protected shoreline will be impervious area. That's when two things have to occur. Now the stormwater management plan actually has to be designed by a professional engineer. But most importantly, if any one grid segment within that waterfront buffer area does not meet that 25-point minimum score, that's when some landscaping needs to occur. The landscaping needs to be designed in a way so that upon completion of some additional plantings and revegetating those areas, that each grid segment now has 25 points worth of vegetation. There's a prescribed way to achieve that. It doesn't have to come solely by way of planting, say, 1-inch saplings. Lawn can be converted to natural ground covers, low bush blueberry bushes, shrubs, bushes and shrubbery that's aesthetically pleasing, it's attractive, doesn't impede views, but provides a much greater benefit to the water in terms of intercepting stormwater and providing shade over the water's edge, and again, intercepting stormwater. So again, if we looked at this lot here, and you can see a few of the grid segments don't meet that 25-point score, within each of those grid segments, additional plantings would have to occur. When folks propose these types of projects, when they're increasing the size of an existing home or expanding the home or putting in a driveway, through the shoreline permitting process, on their plans, they're required to demonstrate to DES how they're going to bring that point score up within each grid segment. Looking at this lot here that I showed you a moment ago, you could only see a couple trees within one of those grid segments. A few of them certainly have no vegetation. It's largely lawn. If these folks develop this site in a way that pushed them over 30%, that would not trigger the need for shore. If they did go over 30%, that does trigger the need to enhance each of these grid segments with additional vegetation. There are pervious surfaces out there. Pervious surfaces actually are sound, hard, structurally sound surfaces that do have the ability to infiltrate stormwater. Looking at this one here, this is a pervious surface here. I believe there's a gentleman in the back that is well versed with these materials here. If these are designed and installed the right way, according to specifications, these surfaces actually have the ability to infiltrate stormwater. The block itself is impervious, but it's designed in a way that there's a gapping system there, there's an underlayment where there's crushed stone and sand so that can intercept stormwater. When you use surfaces like this, and this one here is a pervious asphalt, the top half, this asphalt is actually designed in a way that it can absorb stormwater, believe it or not. The bottom half you can see is a more traditional asphalt where there's sheet flow, there's stormwater racing off to a catch basin. The top half is a pervious asphalt. If you use surfaces like this, they're not considered impervious. So if you had a site like this that you were developing and you wanted to stay below the 30% threshold like these folks did, these folks wanted to build a larger home, frankly, and they had no interest in enhancing the waterfront buffer with additional vegetation. So what they did is they took the driveway and they converted it to a pervious asphalt. This driveway has the ability to infiltrate stormwater. The shoreline permitting process, I'd like to touch on really quickly. I'm not going to go into all the gritty details of it, but these activities here are the types of activities that trigger the need for a shoreline permit. What requires a shoreline permit? It's these activities right here. It's excavation with mechanized equipment, meaning you're bringing in mechanized equipment, bulldozers, backhoes, etc. You're digging into the earth. Bringing in fill, meaning you're changing the contour of the land. Or, lastly, constructing new structures. If you're constructing new structures in a way that it's increasing impervious area, expanding those impervious area footprints, that's what triggers the need for a shoreline permit. So, digging like this with a backhoe, you're engaging in an activity like this is what triggers the need for a shoreline permit. Even if you're using a small little piece of equipment like this, a small bobcat, it's a mechanized piece of equipment. If you're using just hand tools, you have a project, and you're going to hack away with it with just a bunch of shovels, technically, that wouldn't require a shoreline permit, provided you're not adding any fill and you're not building out any structures. Unbelievably, we had a guy a few years ago who wanted to put a new foundation in a house, and he insisted on not going through the permitting process. He dug the whole thing out by hand. All the power to him. This is not fill. You know, if you have an existing lawn and you want to maintain it, maybe smooth it out, fill out a couple little depressions on it, great. If you look in the background, you can see some skunk cabbage coming up there. It looks pretty wet in the back. It's very likely a wetland. You wouldn't want to put the fill in the wetland. Okay, the take-home point here is this: putting in, you know, a couple truckloads of loam to maintain existing lawns is not considered fill. Doing something like this, expanding the size of existing open areas, putting in some retaining walls, backfilling, you know, these are major changes in contour and requires a shoreline permit. A project like this here, along the water's edge, taking out an old walkway and redesigning it like this here, activities like this require a shoreline permit. Putting in new patios, new walkways, that's expanding the size of existing structures. The landscapers in the audience, don't be intimidated by the shoreline permitting process. If you haven't done so already, I would highly encourage you to get involved with the permitting process. I think it would be a feather in your cap, a benefit to you to tell prospective clients and landowners that, no, I can take care of it. You don't have to hire this out to some other professional consultant. I can do this for you. Because you don't have to be a licensed land surveyor. You don't have to be an engineer. You, as the landscaper, can complete and submit the shoreline permit application for the property owner. So again, don't be intimidated by the process. It may look a little daunting to you initially, but like anything, with a little practice, a little time, it's something that you can work through. So installing new retaining walls, this too requires a shoreline permit. Patios, of course. Just want to touch on existing walkways, replacing things in kind, replacing impervious surfaces within the same footprint does not require a shoreline permit. If you're not bringing in, you know, you're not bringing in an excavator to, you know, to dig this thing out, you're not bringing in fill, you're not increasing the size of it, that does not trigger the need for a shoreline permit. Same thing with existing patios. Even if you wanted to bring a piece of machinery in and just kind of pluck these things up and then drop in a new surface, if you could, if you did it in a way that you stayed within that existing footprint, that would not require a shoreline permit. Whenever you're working near the water or in the water, you're starting to get into a different law, wetlands law. Retaining walls and such can be repaired in kind, same height, same dimension, but requires a wetlands permit rather than a shoreline permit. I've got a recommendation for a new ringtone for you. Sorry. Expanding property into a water body is a bad idea. These folks here in Meredith, on Lake Waukesha, these folks came up from the small state that's just a little to the south of us, came up. They actually had a shoreline permit, and they had a wetlands permit, and they built the home. They built it exactly in the right footprint, and they built the deck. Everything matched exactly what we permitted. The contractors left. They hired the landscapers. The landscaper came in. They were never shown the plans, and they were asked to extend the property just a couple feet out into the water. You cannot fill public water bodies in the state of New Hampshire. This was a violation. These folks are now in the process of submitting a restoration plan to remove this wall from Lake Waukesha. I just visited a site today. I actually made a trip this morning around the lake and just stopped at a couple enforcement sites. I stopped at a site today where somebody had submitted a complaint to DES. And when I arrived, I knew they had a wetlands permit, and I had the feeling that they were building this retaining wall in accordance with what we permitted. But again, what I learned is when I arrived, the landscapers didn't even know that the property owner had a permit, and they hadn't even looked at the plan yet. So the take-home point here is that if you're working in the protected shoreline and you're working near the water, always check in, get a sense of what permits have been issued, and get a hold of those plans. Very, very important. We receive a lot of requests for sites like this here, where the shoreline is stable, it's vegetated, it's intact, and folks want to put a retaining wall in, right along the water's edge and backfill with a lawn. It's not permissible. Whenever you are impacting the water body like this, or putting a retaining wall along the water's edge, it requires a wetlands permit. Under wetlands law, you need to demonstrate the need. What's the need for the retaining wall? Somebody trying to tell me something here? Okay. So the take-home point here is this site is stable, it's well vegetated, and a new wall in a situation like this isn't permissible. If shorelines, areas are eroding away or becoming unstable, restoring them with natural vegetation is the prescribed way to do that. There are many low-impact projects that can be accomplished with a shoreland permit by notification. If your project is, a relatively small project, and you're proposing no more than 1,500 square feet of new impervious area, or it's a project, say, where you're just trying to do the right thing and you want to install some of these stormwater management features, the project very likely qualifies for what we call a shoreland permit by notification. It's a streamlined permitting process where you can get a shoreland permit by email in just 5 days. You show that you meet the criteria, you show us some plans, it's a relatively easy project. If anybody here ever has any thoughts on a project, or landscapers in the audience, property owners, you need assistance with the permitting process, you have an idea, you want to talk about it, maybe meet a DES, or maybe you have a plan, you can fire me an email. I'd love to see the plan, we can talk about it over the phone, I can walk you through the permitting process. Take a look at the shoreline permit application, highlight those areas that seem to be trouble spots, and give me a call and we can talk about it, and we can work through it. Here is the typical permit. When folks do receive a shoreline permit or a wetlands permit, this is required to be tacked up like most building permits, so it can be easily recognized, in a prominent location on site. As landscapers, if you don't see this, that's a problem. Take a look at the permit conditions. There are very specific conditions on that permit that's issued. They speak to the plan that was approved. It's a dated plan that shows the footprints of those impervious areas. It also speaks to erosion controls. Whatever web browser you use, maybe Google, the best way to get to the Shoreline Program website is just to punch in NH Shoreline Program. Don't go to the DES main page, it's a disaster. It's basically just lists of lists of lists. Just go directly to the Shoreline Program website. On this site here, there's a ton of useful information, particularly under the Hot Topics section. You can click on Determine if a shoreline permit is required. Just depending on how you respond to some of these questions, this tool is able to determine if a shoreline permit is required, able to determine if you qualify for some of the exemptions, help you determine if you qualify for the shoreline permit by notification process. Here's the permit application status check. If a property owner tells you, oh, I have a shoreline permit, but I don't have it on site, you can't see it, you can check this tool, you can use this tool right here. It really gives you direct access to our database. You can punch in the physical address, the property owner's name, or even the tax map and lot number, and have direct access to see what permits have been issued. You can even download a copy of the permit, not the plans, but the permit itself. Just wanted to touch on erosion controls, as I just mentioned earlier, that all our permits are conditioned to use erosion controls. What are erosion controls? They are mechanisms to put in place to ensure that if you do get a storm event while you're operating near the water body, all the silt and sediment that may wash off your job site doesn't wash directly off into the water. There are systems to retain the silt and sediment. This one here isn't installed properly. It's we call this more of a silt flag, just blowing around the breeze here. It's not even tucked in, okay? At least make an effort to try to get it tucked in on the ground like this here. This is a silt fence installed properly. This will function. Not the best system here. Maybe using some matting like this here. Silt socks, great, easy way to manage your stormwater. If you're working right along the water's edge, most of our permits today will be conditioned so that you use features like this, like turbidity curtains and such, to contain that sediment and that stormwater into one localized area. So here's my contact information. I hope you have a better understanding today of what really the Shoreline Protection Act is trying to achieve. It's recognizing, like Barb and Lisa spoke to earlier, the need to better manage our stormwater. It goes much beyond just protecting trees. It recognizes the need to better manage our stormwater and provide some of that critical wildlife habitat. Going forward, if you leave here today and you're scratching your head, oh, I wish I would ask that question, or I have this kind of project coming up, contact me, email me. Email is really best. I'm probably more apt to get a more expedient response just by shooting me an email. So that's it. I hope that wasn't too painful for you. If you have any questions, certainly we can take a couple questions, and be more than happy to take them. And I'll repeat the questions as well. Yeah.
What's the relationship between 25% undisturbed, minimum, 20% maximum impervious?
What is the relationship between having 25% in the unaltered state? I don't know if you could say there's really a relationship, but I think when the law was being crafted and looking at having some minimum standards and looking at the science that exists, the law is trying to strike that balance between allowing wise growth to occur, and having some level of environmental protection, yet while also simultaneously recognizing the need for private property rights as well.
The reason I asked is one might infer 25% undisturbed, disturbed 75%.
That's right. Yeah, the law technically allows for a disruption between 50 and 150 of 75%. Correct. But there certainly is that entire region couldn't be impervious either. It's the area of the entire lot within the protected shoreline that's regulated. Yes.
I'm curious, so for instance, the walking one build-up, who reports it? Is it up to a neighbor? And who's responsible? Is it the landscaper who did it, or the homeowner? Who gets?
Oh, the enforcement piece, that's a great question, really. That's what you're getting at. I mean, the bottom line is, at the end of the day, DES, we're very short-staffed. We don't have a whole lot of numbers. We don't have a whole lot of bodies that are out there monitoring this, and we rely heavily on the public, lake associations like yourself, and conservation commissions, et cetera. This particular complaint actually came in from the abutter because the wall that you saw there actually extends over onto the abutter's property as well. Some people you may hear, there are some misconceptions out there that, there are folks, there are developers, there are landscapers, et cetera, that they'll just do what they want to do and they'll pay the fines associated with the violation. And that's not the case. If it's really egregious, like the one I showed you a moment ago, DES will pursue it vigorously, and will request complete and full restoration. And restoration can be achieved by many ways, including complete removal of that retaining wall, And in the cases where vegetation is removed, obviously, if somebody clear cuts a piece of property, it's very difficult to restore a property with new 12-inch trees, but we will require that the property be restored and that restoration be accomplished by a professional landscaper or a certified wetland scientist and monitored for a number of years. And we require that monitoring reports be submitted to DES for a number of years in growing seasons to demonstrate that those areas are being restored so that they can return to their original condition to the greatest extent practicable. Any other questions before I go? You have me here, you might as well.
Clarify the 1,500 square foot rural commission, not rural commission, but
Permit by notification.
vertical. That would apply to like someone who's being going to a small patio or deck?
So the question is, can you clarify the permit by notification process? And the permit by notification process was designed for small projects like maybe installing a detached garage or a patio, and you're doing that in a way that you're not increasing your impervious area by more than 900 square feet. Your total impact area is less than 1,500 square feet. If that's the case, you qualify for the shoreline permit by notification. It's a relatively simplified version of the application form. You certify that you meet some of these minimum standards, and you can receive that permit through email in 5 days. All right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all, but those of you who live on Wentworth, I'm going to remind you that this year is drawdown, so get your permits going. So that's a friendly reminder. And I want to thank everybody, our presenters. I want to thank all of you, our sponsors, and thanks for coming. And looks like you ate the food. Did you drink the beer? Thank you, everybody.